Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Mr. Rono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez,
No. No, I mean, I realize it's completely.
Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran,
It's one cloture.
Mr. Mullen, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla,
Are you going home?
Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Vance, Mr. Vance, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Barrasso, Britt, Brown, Cantwell, Capito, Cardin, Casey, Cassidy, Collins, Cornyn, Cortez Masto, Kramer, Daines, Durbin, Hassan, Heinrich, Hickenlooper, King, Klobuchar, Langford, McConnell, Moran, Murray, Ossoff, Rich, Rounds, Rubio, Schatz, Schumer, Shaheen, Sinema, Tillis, Tuberville, Young. Senators voting in the negative: Braun, Paul. Mr. Padilla, aye. Mr. Romney, aye. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Mr. Grassley, aye. Ms. Smith, aye. Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Coons, aye. Mr. Tester, aye. Ms. Hirono, aye. Mr. Scott of Florida, aye. Mr. Wyden, aye. Mr. Fetterman, aye. Mr. Merkley, aye. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mrs. Blackburn, no. Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Mr. Marshall, Mr. Marshall, no. And Mr. Graham, aye.
Sorry, don't move back.
Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Kennedy, aye. Mr. Crapo, aye. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Schmidt, no. Mr. Kane, aye. Ms. Ernst, aye. Ms. Warren, aye. Mr. Kelly,
Are you kidding?
aye. Mr. Budd, aye. Mr. Manchin, aye. Mr. Mullen, aye. Mr. Mrs. Fisher, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Mr. Markey, Mr. Markey, aye. Mr. Warnock, Mr. Warnock, aye. Ms. Duckworth, Ms. Duckworth, aye. Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Van Hollen, aye. Mr. Peters, aye. Ms. Rosen, aye. Mr. Sullivan,
To bring it back?
Yeah.
Yes, that'd be great, because I have a copy I could read from, but
Aye.
that would be.
Mr. Vance, no. Mrs. Hyde Smith, aye. Ms. Lummis. Ms. Lummis. Aye.
390.
Mr. Booker. Mr. Booker. Aye. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett. Aye. Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch. Aye. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Menendez. Aye. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wicker. Aye. Mr. Cotton, Mr. Cotton. Aye. Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Bozeman. Aye. Mr. Lee, no. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Haggerty, no.
On this vote, the yeas are 88, the nays are 9. Under the previous order requiring 60 votes for the passage of this bill, the bill is passed.
Full of twists and turns, but the American people can breathe a sigh of relief. There will be no government shutdown. Democrats have said from the start that the only solution for avoiding a shutdown is bipartisanship, and we're glad that Speaker McCarthy has finally heeded our message. In the end, more Democrats supported this bill in the House than Republicans, proving bipartisanship was the best answer all along. I want to thank my colleagues here in the Senate, especially our appropriators, yourself, Madam President, Susan Collins, and Leader McConnell. Our bipartisan work in the Senate set the tone for the bill we're about to pass. Our bipartisanship made this possible and showed the House that they had to act. We will keep the government open for 45 days with a clean CR at current funding levels. And we avoided all of the extreme, nasty, and harmful cuts MAGA Republicans wanted. No 30% cuts across the board. No 30% cuts to things like health care, to the Social Security Administration, to the nutrition programs for kids. Full reauthorization of the FAA until December 31st. And the poison pill amendments, of which there were scores, MAGA-inspired riders, were all removed from the bill. After trying to take our government hostage, MAGA Republicans won nothing. So one more time, it is good Speaker McCarthy finally heeded our message that bipartisans have failed, bipartisanship has prevailed, and both parties have come together to avert a shutdown. Once again, thank you to Leader McConnell, Appropriations Chair Patty Murray, Vice Chair Susan Collins, and members on both sides of the aisle who came together. Today's CR would not have been possible without the Senate's good work. The Senate showed that bipartisanship was the only way, and the same will be true again in 45 days. I yield the floor. I do not yet yield the floor. President, I move to proceed to executive session to consider Calendar 319.
Question is on the motion. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. Ayes appear to have it. Ayes do have it. Motion's agreed to. Clerk will report.
Nomination, Department of State, James C. O'Brien of Nebraska to be an Assistant Secretary, European and Eurasian Affairs.
I send a cloture motion to the desk.
Clerk will report.
Cloture motion, we the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a closed debate on the nomination of Executive Calendar Number 319, James C. O'Brien, Assistant Secretary of State, European and Eurasian Affairs, signed by 17 senators as follows.
I ask consent the reading of the names be waived.
Without objection.
I move to proceed to legislative session.
Clerk will report.
Cloture motion, we the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a closed debate on the nomination of Executive Calendar Number 176, Brendan Abel Herson of Maryland to be United States District Judge for the District of Maryland, signed by 19 senators as follows.
I ask consent the reading of the names be waived.
Without objection.
I move to proceed to legislative session.
Questions on the motion. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. Ayes appear to have it. Ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to.
I move to proceed to executive session to consider Calendar 264.
Questions on the motion. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. Ayes appear to have it. Ayes do have it. Motion is agreed to. Clerk will report.
Nomination, the Judiciary, Susan Kim to Clerk of Michigan to be United States District Judge for the Eastern District of Michigan.
I send a cloture motion to the desk.
The clerk will report.
Cloture motion, we, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a closed debate on the nomination of Executive Calendar Number 264, Susan Kim to Clerk of Michigan to be United States District Judge for the Eastern District of Michigan, signed by 17 senators as follows.
I ask consent the reading of the names be waived.
Without objection.
Finally, I ask unanimous consent that the mandatory quorum calls for the cloture motions filed today, September the 30th, be waived.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent the Senate consider the following nominations en bloc, calendars 252, 254. That the Senate vote on the nominations en bloc without intervening action or debate. The motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table. That the President be immediately notified of the Senate's actions.
Without objection.
The question to any of the nominations, and that the President be immediately notified of the Senate's actions.
Without objection.
Is that all of our? I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to legislative session and be in a period of morning business with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I understand there's a bill at the desk, and I ask for its first reading.
The clerk will read the title of the bill for the first time.
H.R. 5692, an act making supplemental appropriations for the fiscal year ending September 30, 2024, and for other purposes.
I now ask for a second reading, and in order to place the bill on the calendar under the provisions of Rule 14, I object to my own request.
The objection having been heard, the bill will be read a second time on the next legislative day.
I ask unanimous consent that the Committee on Finance be discharged and the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of S-2231.
The clerk will report.
S-2231, a bill to amend Title V of the Social Security Act to support stillbirth prevention and research and for other purposes.
Without objection, the committee is discharged.
I further ask the
Senate
bill
will
be
proceed.
I further ask that the bill be considered, read a third time, and passed. The motion to reconsider be considered and made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent the Committee on Commerce be discharged of Senate Res 310, and the Senate now proceed to the en bloc consideration of the following Senate resolutions: S Res 310, S Res 390, S Res 391, S Res 392. 392 being the Maui wildfire first responders.
Is there objection to proceeding to the resolutions en bloc?
Consent the resolution be agreed to, the preamble be agreed to, and that the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Without objection.
And finally, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that when the Senate two of them. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that when the Senate completes its business today, it stand adjourned under the previous provisions of S-Res 393 until 3 p.m. on Tuesday, October 3rd. That following the prayer and pledge, the Journal of Proceedings be approved to date, the morning hour be deemed expired, the time for the two leaders be reserved for their use later in the day, and morning business be closed. That upon the conclusion of morning business, the Senate proceed to executive session, resume consideration of the O'Brien nomination. Further, that the cloture motions filed during today's session ripen at 5:30 p.m. on Tuesday.
Without objection.
If there's no further business to come before the Senate, I ask that it stand adjourned under the previous order, following the remarks of Chairman Murray.
Without objection.
Good job.
President Pro Tem.
Mr. President, I've been down here all week saying again and again, the only way that we're going to avoid a shutdown is a CR that can get bipartisan support to quickly pass the House and Senate. And we've been working nonstop to pass that common sense bipartisan CR that I put together with my colleagues across the aisle. But tonight we had a bill from the House that passed in a bipartisan way with nearly partisan way, Democrat voting in support. And I'm now glad the Senate has been able to pass it as well and get it to the President's desk for his signature. This bill does not contain the devastating cuts House Republicans were pushing just yet, but it is certainly good to see that some House Republicans have, at the least, for this moment, given up the fruitless and cruel cuts they were demanding just yesterday. It's good to see some of those members coming to their senses, but we also have to be clear about where this bill falls seriously short. why we found ourselves in this moment, and how House Republicans' recklessness has caused so much unnecessary chaos. Because let's be clear, there is a lot of work left to do now that we've passed this bill. First, we have to absolutely do more to support our allies in Ukraine. Dictators across the world are watching. Will we stand with democracy? I say yes. The Senate absolutely will stand with our friends in Ukraine as they continue to defend themselves against Putin's brutal invasion. Because continuing to support Ukraine is not just about addressing a humanitarian crisis, it is also about our own national security and what kind of world we want to live in. It is in America's national security interest to send a strong message to dictators like Putin that they cannot just invade a sovereign nation and steamroll democracy wherever and whenever they want. And let's make sure we are crystal clear about this. There are strong, bipartisan supermajorities in both chambers have shown that they understood that. Just a few days ago, support for Ukraine got over 330 votes in the House. 3 in 4 House members. The U.S. does not abandon its allies, and the U.S. will not give Putin a free pass to continue his brutal war of aggression. I need to make it clear, we are sticking with our allies in Ukraine, and we're not letting it. Colleagues, I'm positive you are hearing from your constituents on this. I am ready to work with anyone to make progress here, so please talk to me, and let's work together on that front. Now, let me also say there was no reason for it to come this close. House Republicans should have worked with us from the very start. Instead, they spent weeks entertaining the most extreme ideas from their far right, spending the last week voting on really extreme appropriations bill that would not even actually have averted a shutdown. Appropriations bills that would deny our service members the ability to get reproductive care they need in emergencies, severely restricting women's access to medication abortion in every state, bills that would decimate rural communities, eliminate essential resources for our diplomats abroad, and so much more. And then, just yesterday, they proposed an across-the-board 30% cut to virtually all domestic spending. They wanted to gut funding come Monday for childcare, support for K-12 schools, law enforcement, heating assistance for families on tight budgets, air traffic controllers, life-saving cancer research, much more. Even that proposal, apparently, wasn't enough for the most extreme members of the House Republican Conference, and it went down in flames. But let's not forget, and I know the American people won't, that the vast majority of House Republicans voted just yesterday to gut programs families count on, programs that keep all of us safe, by 30%. Needless to say, I am glad to see some of them have, at least for the moment, abandoned those cruel efforts to slash funding for families with no rhyme or reason. Now, as we look ahead, I urge my back here in a few weeks. On that note, we need to get moving to the Military Construction, Veterans Affairs, THUD, and Ag Appropriations minibus that a few of my colleagues, very few of them, have been blocking. I hope both leaders will facilitate the Vice Chair and I getting back to work on those bills in the next few days. And as we pass short-term CR, we need to make progress to begin conferencing our spending bills with the House to avoid another CR or an omnibus at the end of this year, which I know my colleagues are focused on avoiding. And if we're going to get any of that done, it has to be bipartisan. It is going to involve us being serious and focused on getting our job done to have real results for American people. If there is one lesson for House Republicans to take from the absolute chaos they have caused this past week, it is that partisanship is not a path forward, it's a path to chaos. The only way to avoid a shutdown, the only way to get things done, especially in a divided Congress, is to sit down with the other side and do the hard work of negotiating, talking to one another, not to cave to the most extreme members of your caucus or go back on your word. I think most of us have known that from the start. Apparently, Speaker McCarthy needed to learn that lesson the hard way. Now it's time for him to show he has truly learned it. I urge him not to retreat back to a partisan corner, not to push for extreme partisan spending bills that go back on the deal he made just a few months ago. If you follow the most extreme members of your party path, they're going to lead you to the same dead end. The American people need us to move forward. They need us to work together. The senior senator from Maine and I have 12 bipartisan bills in the Senate.
Madam President.
Senator from Colorado is recognized.
Thank you, Madam President. I'd ask the quorum call be vitiated,
You will.
and I'd ask to be able to speak without objection. And
Without objection.
thank you. Thank you, Madam President. I'm sorry that you're having to stay here so late tonight, but I'm glad you're in the chair. I wanted to come down to the floor now that the vote is done just to explain the objection that I made earlier today. I'm not going to do it at elaborate length, but I think it's important to say I was deeply disappointed, as were many people, that the deal to keep the government open did not actually have as part of it continuing funding for Ukraine, which I think is critically important. I think most couldn't imagine a worse place in the world to be born at that time than where my mom was born. And she and her parents and an aunt survived. Everybody else was killed. And as everybody in this chamber knows, certainly the presiding officer knows, 16 million people were killed in Ukraine and in Poland by the Nazis and by Stalin. And my mom cannot believe that she has lived long enough to see another land war break out in Europe. That's what she says to me. I can't believe I lived long enough to see this. And I almost can't believe it either, because we had gotten used to reliance on our international organizations, the rule of law, the idea that democracy had spread, the idea that capitalism had spread. And there were some people, when the Berlin Wall fell down in the late 1980s, that were writing books about how this was the kind of the end of history, because we had the liberal, small L liberal, not big L liberal, the small liberal order had prevailed. And of course, we know now that wasn't true, and we know now that there is a contest in the world of at least two very different visions of how humans should organize themselves. We believe in democracy. We believe in the rule of law. We believe in freedom of speech and freedom of the press. Vladimir Putin believes in none of those things, and Xi Jinping, and it has been. That doesn't mean they don't have serious military capabilities. That doesn't mean that he wouldn't unleash battlefield nuclear weapons at the drop of a hat, or chemical weapons at the drop of a hat, if he felt like he was losing in a way that threatened his regime or threatened him. I certainly am clear-eyed about that. I know the presiding officer is, and everybody else is. But his army is a lot more hollowed out than he thought it was. And that's what happens when you're a totalitarian living on top of a totalitarian society. No one actually tells you the truth. No one says, Vladimir Putin, your army has been hollowed out. We've wasted all that money that you asked us to spend on the army through corruption and other kinds of things. And so that was one fundamental mistake. A second fundamental mistake was his failure to understand what the Ukrainian people's reaction would be. We didn't get it all right. Some of our intelligence wasn't right. There were people that were saying that Putin was going to be in Kyiv in 72 hours. There was a feeling that Zelensky's government would collapse and that the Russians would have a puppet government in Kyiv. And instead, what has happened is the Ukrainian people have exhibited more bravery than anybody could have ever asked for. It's astonishing what they have done. And to me, it's astonishing what they've accomplished. You hear people in the press these days talking about the stalemate on the frontier or on the battle line, the front line, as if that's somehow a failure on the part of the Ukrainian people. I see that as exactly the opposite. Ukrainian people, that they would demand of their elected officials that we do more, do more, do more. And that's what people have said in countries all over the world. That he didn't count on either. And that's been an amazing thing over the last 2 years. After we had a president here who cast a lot of doubt on whether NATO was even something important. or whether the rule of law was something important, or whether the U.S. following through on our commitments was even something important, and we've shown that none of that is true. And NATO is stronger today than it's ever been. The transatlantic alliance is stronger today than it has ever been. We have allies from Europe to Asia who understand what the importance of this fight is. They know that this is not just a fight for Ukraine. They know the Ukrainians aren't just fighting for Ukraine, although that's an important fight. That's an important battle. They know this is a fight for democracy. This is a fight for the free world. And there is no way that this fight would have been as successful as it has been without U.S. assistance, without U.S. intelligence. This is one where the good guys have come together in a way that's really meaningful and in a way that the tyrants in this world, I think, were not expecting. And in a way that and our intelligence community certainly thinks that Xi Jinping is now having to think twice and 3 times and 4 times about whether or not he's going to, where you didn't need a microphone in the old days and humans were talking to humans. People showed up to have these debates and have these conversations, and here we were, 100 humans who were in the Senate, who happen to be in the Senate today. And here's this guy, President Zelensky, who, until 3 years ago or so, or 4 years ago maybe, was an actor in his home country, in Ukraine, and who ran for office almost as a lark because there was so much corruption that he felt like he had an obligation as a citizen to run for president, to try to overcome that corruption. And then something happened that he probably didn't think was going to happen, which is Putin invaded Ukraine, and the entire weight of the world dropped on on President Zelensky's head. Just a human being, one human being, not the tallest guy I've ever seen, not the strongest guy I've ever seen, a pretty regular person standing there in his fatigues, and the entire weight of the world is on his shoulders. And our support of the Ukrainian people, because of what they've been willing to do, not just for Ukraine, but for democracy, has made a huge difference to them and to what President Zelensky is trying to accomplish. And tonight, I did object earlier because I was worried that I thought it was important for us to make sure we sent a clear message that we're not leaving Washington here, our political disputes here, to keep us from delivering the aid that Ukraine needs. We can't do it. And I think there are probably some people who thought when we left today that's what we were doing. I thought it was important for the leadership of the Senate to put out a statement tonight, Senator Schumer and Senator McConnell and several others on each side of the aisle, underscoring that we are going to spend the next 45 days working together to pass a robust Ukraine aid package. And I think that's vitally important. And I hope in a small way, hopefully we all had the chance today to think again about how important this is, how important our leadership is, how important our presence here as human beings is. We're not going to get another chance at this, I suspect, Madam President. I suspect that we're going to have one chance, and that chance is going to be 45 days from now. And this chamber, just like President Zelensky has done, just like the Ukrainian people have done, he said, in fact, that we're giving our lives. All we're asking you for is your money. He's right about that. They are giving our lives. And I think that if we had entered this war or watched this war happen starting 2 years ago, and we had not supported the Ukrainian people in the way that we have, the world wouldn't have supported them. and they wouldn't have made the extraordinary progress that they've made. And who knows how this could end? We don't know. It's important for us to stay in this fight. It's important to us to continue to lead. It is important for us. I yield the floor.
No.
Withhold that.
Under the previous order and pursuant to S. Res. 393, the Senate stands adjourned until 3 p.m. on Tuesday, October 3rd, 2023, and does so as a further mark of respect to the late Duncan McLaughlin Locke Faircloth, former senator from the state of North Carolina.